which is my favorite conference at the Mises Institute. I say it every year, but meanwhile, so I'm really a teacher, and so as a teacher, you know that you have to repeat the important things in life. I love you. I hate government. And Mises University is wonderful, right? Because we have this great group and of enthusiastic and increasingly well-informed, well-trained people, and a great crowd coming from all corners of the world, which I enjoy very much, and which you will enjoy also. Some, of course, learn a little bit less, even though assisting the entire week here. So last year we had David Gordon on the very last day rising and said he just had one question left. Who is this von Moses? So we don't want this to happen again. Therefore, we'll talk now a little bit about the life and work of Ludwig von Mises. I'll start with the life, and then a few things to say, and then we'll get to the works. Mises was born in 1881 in Lemberg, which was at the time, which is today part of the country called the Ukraine, and at the time was part of Austria-Hungary. Yeah. Oh, please turn it. How does this work? I need to take this off. All right. All right, okay. It's not very sharp. Can I get more contrast here? Focus. Maybe black light? Yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay, so this is a map of a continent called Europe. And you see here Austria-Hungary, which is southeast of a very beautiful country with nice exposure to the Baltics and to various other waters. Next to Italy, over there we have France, and so on. Switzerland, you see a dot here. This is Geneva, which I will talk a little bit later. You see, it's fairly big. Hungary was a fairly big country. It was, in fact, the second largest political entity in Europe, next only to Russia. So bigger than France, bigger than Spain, bigger than Germany, bigger than Sweden. So Mises was born in Lemberg, which is in this part here. Where's this? I'll put on another map. So this is the Austria-Hungary. Normal light. Yep. So up here we have Lemberg. This is Vienna, which is today the capital of the country called Austria. At the time it was Austria-Hungary. And it's called Austria-Hungary because it was politically a combination, union of two kingdoms. One was the Kingdom of Hungary. This is the big greenish, on my map it's brownish dot. And all the rest was, so to say, didn't have a proper name. It was called the countries that are represented in the Reichsrat, so in the Reichscouncil, kind of the parliament, if you wish. So anyways, it was a big country, and Mises was born in this upper corner. And when he was still a boy, he moved with his family to Vienna. His father was a railroad engineer, and he joined the railroad ministry. It's a habitude of governments that they depoliticize all things in life. So railroads were a very big industry in the 19th century. It was a top industry, so it was only a question of time until government got its claws into this industry and regulated it and nationalized it and so on. So the father moved to Vienna. The family followed. Mises got his education there. He went to school and eventually to the university in 1900. When he arrived at the university, he was politically interested. And so he set out for law studies. There was no program of political science at the time, no program of economics. So the only way to study these fields was to study law, which was the basic discipline, and then later on specialize in those courses that were of most interest for you, political theory or economics and so on. When Mises arrived at the university, he was politically interested, but he was firmly convinced that government regulation of the economy was necessary and that governments would have to run the show, so to say, to control private enterprise. He was not from the outset opposed to nationalizations, etc. He was also somewhat influenced by historicism, that is by the idea that social relationships should be studied only from an historical point of view. That is, ultimately, the idea is here that there are no general or universal laws of economics, for example, or social laws of any sort. So you only have to study the particular conditions that prevail at particular places and particular points of time, each for itself. So Mises was somehow influenced by this. And at the university, he had some of the top scholars of the time defending such ideas, among which was Eugen von Filipovich, was a famous interventionist scholar, and others. And Mises took part in their seminars, and he was therefore got an instruction also in Marxism, and in particular in Marxian class analysis, which is the heart of the Marxist analysis of social relations. Then 2 years later, his intellectual life completely changed when he read a book by one of the Vienna professors with whom he didn't have any class and with whom he would never have a class because the author had to quit the university in the same year. It was 1902. And the author was Karl Menger. The title of the book was Principles of Economics. So, of course, in German, Grundsätze der Volkswirtschaftslehre. And this was what changed Mises' outlook on economic science and ultimately also on politics and on history. For here with Menger, he saw that there was such a thing as economic laws, causal laws, not only therefore in nature, but also in human action, that related not only to individual behavior, but also to groups, nations and so on, markets, firms and so on. So this is something that he saw in Menger for the first time, and he saw more than this. He saw that in the light of this theory, which was a realistic theory of the causal relationships at work in an economy, it could be seen that the market was a rational process. It was not just a chaotic side-by-side of different individuals and groups struggling for political supremacy, but it was a rational order in which the activities of each were rewarded only to the extent that they rendered services to their fellow men, to consumers in particular. So this changed his outlook, and in the following years, after 1906, when he got his doctorate, he would attend the seminar of one of Karl Menger's most important followers, or possibly the most important follower of Karl Menger, who was Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, was a professor of economics also at the University of Vienna, but especially he was a former Ministry of Finance and was therefore very well known both within Austria and internationally. Böhm-Bawerk was the author of a completely new theory of interest and of capital, about which I will say something later on. So he took part in this seminar, and parallel to this, he started his career. He first worked in what was the equivalent of the American IRS, okay? Because this is also what Böhm-Bawerk had done. It was a very prestigious career path. I mean, today, it's not, in that respect, it's not comparable to the IRS today. If you tell your parents, well, I start working with the IRS, I mean, you might be a particularly difficult crowd in that respect, right? But even an average person comes home and says, I'm working for the IRS. Ooh, it's not really something that creates enthusiasm or admiration. It's, by the way, a very wonderful fact of American mentality and character, right? You don't grow exuberant when you find a job with the government. But that's what Mises did anyway. In his time, we have to remind us, was a different age, and so it was very prestigious, but Mises could not suffer it. Okay, so he very soon discovered that bureaucracy was really nothing for him, and being just a little wheel in an enormous machine in which he would progress slowly year by year and had to obey rules constantly, was never any place for initiative. This was not just his cup of tea, as we say here. So he quit this administration very quickly, and he started a career in law. Started working for a law firm, but here too he stayed just about 1.5 or 2 years. And ultimately, because he encountered the same problems that he had experienced in the fiscal administration on a somewhat lower level, on a different level. Because, of course, in law too, you had to deal with the courts, were always government institutions, we had regulations everywhere, there was not much place for initiative and so on. He didn't like it at all. So he joined the Vienna Chamber of Commerce, or more precisely the Lower Austria Chamber of Commerce, which was located in Vienna, and started a career here, which he would pursue for many years, for 25 years precisely. Now, what was so interesting about the Chamber of Commerce? Well, the Chambers of Commerce had a much higher standing in those days than they have today. And especially for somebody interested in politics, they were way more interesting, especially in those very days. Because this was at the onset of large-scale government interventionism in Austria in industry and many other fields of many other economic sectors. Now, the government wanted to do this, or more precisely, the parliament wanted to do this, but they didn't have the knowledge of the concrete conditions prevailing in the different industries. They wanted to regulate them, but they didn't know exactly how to do this because they didn't know the first thing about business and about economics. So they needed competent manpower, and this competent manpower was delivered by the Chamber of Commerce. And they counseled with all parties, not just one party in particular, but all parties got advice. And so they were writing proposals for legislation and so on, always in under the commission of different parties. And on the other hand, and that was the interesting part of this, there was, of course, also the possibility to comment on these proposals, comment directly in discussions with the people from the parliament and from the government, but also comment in journal articles in the daily press. And that's exactly what Mises did. And he relished doing this. Of course, when he started, he would not, of course, in the first few years, he could not just write articles denouncing stupid legislation proposals that he has encountered in practice because he was a beginner. But so he could write under pseudonyms, or he could feed journalists with such information. He could also write articles under a more general heading. It's not a good idea to impose subsidies for meat or subsidies for whatever, milk. And after the war, then World War I, he could attack them more outrightly. So that's what he did. Then came World War I, a big seizure. Mises joined the army. He had, during his university studies, he had a one-year mandatory training, became an officer after this year. So he joined the army as a lieutenant, then very quickly, within the next 4 years, he moved up to the rank of captain, and served essentially on the East Front, and what they called the North Front. So the North Front you have up here, and the East Front. But they essentially called it the North Front because the Russians were attacking from there. So Mises survived this, even though he had to go 3 times to the front, which was not a destiny that all of his colleagues at the chamber, and especially not all of his colleagues at the university had to share. Right? These people, of course, way too important. As an economics professor, you're so important that you need to stay home, way behind the front lines, and tell your government how it needs to run the war economy. So that's what most of the other economists did. And Mises didn't like interventionism at this point, didn't like it at all. So he was not really useful, neither enthusiastic to cooperate in these administrations. So he was available for the front. But he survived, which is a great thing. And so he started his life anew after the war, 1918, when Austria-Hungary disappeared, because we have here a multinational entity. So we have Germans in this area, we have Hungarians here, we have Yugoslavs or Southern Slavs in this area, we have Czechs here, we have Slovaks here, and here we have Russians, Ruthenians, we have a couple of Germans too, here also Germans, Poles, right? So what these different nationalities then did was to secede from Austria-Hungary. So these countries seceded, they created Yugoslavia. They seceded, they created Czechoslovakia. This was taken back into Poland. The Hungarians seceded and created Hungary. This was eaten by the Italians. And so all that was left finally was a relatively little country of this size approximately that we still today on the map as Austria, okay? The leftover country, Austria. So here Mises pursued his career. Leftover Austria, of course, had to inherit all of the government debts. Right? The others, well, this was just this very oppressive regime. Had nothing to do with the good Poles and nothing to do with the good Yugoslavians and so on. It's all for the Austrians, for the Germans. And so they inherited of the debt, they inherited of all the government civil servants and so on. So it was a huge apparatus for a relatively small country. And so conditions were quite difficult. Mises then at that point was very quickly promoted to a chief executive of the chamber, okay, and had therefore a paramount position within Austrian political life, in particular as far as economic policy was concerned. So his commentaries would be writing op-eds for daily newspapers, and they were read and were part of the public debate. And he was very influential as a counselor with the government. And a third activity, he was a professor at the University of Vienna. He was not a regular professor, he was an extraordinary professor, which could probably best be translated not as in the sense of he was not an ordinary, but an extraordinary, was particularly bright or something. He was an adjunct. Okay, so he was a regular professor, and there were, so to say, the irregular professors. He was an adjunct professor. But in distinct contrast to present-day American adjunct professors, so you didn't just have a part-time contract, which could be severed at any point of time. You were paid as you go. Mises had a tenure, so it was a tenured adjunct professor. Okay, and so this position he held then nominally for the rest of his life, but we'll see what happens. His main achievements for the next 16 years, and we're not here talking about ideas, just practical achievements, because in those days he was very much a man of practice and of political action, was to prevent that the country be taken over by a small group of political radicals, also called Bolsheviks. Okay. In those days, 1918, the governments in Germany, in Austria, Hungary collapse, and the governments are taken over in all these countries, also in Hungary and other countries, by socialist, respectively communist governments, which were backed by public consent. So it was not, in all cases, a revolutionary overthrow. So they were backed by popular consent. More precisely, nobody knew exactly how much of a backing they had in the population because there hadn't been any elections for the past 4 years. Okay, so and at the moment when these countries collapse because they lost the war, the socialists, respectively the communists, take over because everybody supposes that they have the public backing, popular backing. And the situation then reverses only a few months later after the first elections after the war. So in spring 1919, and we see, well, the popular support for these people is actually not very high. They don't even have a majority within the population. Okay, so we have a few critical months in which determined revolutionaries could take over a country and have taken over certain countries. Okay. In the case of Hungary, that's what they did, and then they were overthrown again by a militarist coup, by a coup d'etat. In Soviet Russia, as we know, in Russia at the time, they made their revolutionary overthrow and kept the power for 70 years. In Austria, they were almost at the point, because the main political executives of the country were of this inclination. And at this critical juncture, then Mises, who knew them personally because these were friends from his university days, convinced them in private discussions that this would be an unsuitable policy for Austria, irrespective of whether you like communism or not. So his argument was that, look, I mean, if you do this, we'll be cut off of any supplies within a few days, and we'll just hunger and starve. And what will happen then is that the Hungarians come into the country and the Slovenes and so on. All they are hoping for is to give us a good knock because they've always felt so oppressed under our rule. Right? So this is all that we will get. And this argument ultimately won the way. His commie friends did not create the Bolshevik revolution, but on the other hand, they had very strong resentments thereafter against Mises. Right? It's kind of resentment against the messenger who brings the bad news. So he prevented this Bolshevist takeover. He prevented the country from suffering of hyperinflation of the same sort that Germany suffered in 1923. Austria had an inflationary regime, very strong inflationary regime between 1920 and 1922. And inflation is, well, we will discuss during the week in much more detail, is an important vehicle for the finance of government, which is why it exists ultimately. So the governments used it to pay for its expenditure, but of course then the currency was ruined and all the various other negative consequences that follow from it, which we will still discuss also could be seen. So Mises and a few allies stemmed themselves against this, and they prevented that ultimately the currency collapsed, as it did in Germany in 1923. A third achievement, and this brings us already closer to his works, was to bring about something of a change of political mentality. And this not only in Austria, but also in Germany. Mises had a lot of impact on public opinion, especially the intellectuals in both countries through his writings from the pre-war era, but also from the 1920s. So we'll talk about this a little later. In 1934 then, Mises went to Geneva. So he quit his position at the Chamber of Commerce, and he could do this because he had enough years accumulated to qualify for early retirement. So he was finally not that passionate about this kind of administration either. What he was most passionate about was ideas, so economic ideas in particular. And so he seized the opportunity when the Graduate Institute of Higher Education in Economic Studies in Geneva offered him a one-year position as a visiting professor in international economics. The school was very recent, but it was already a prestigious school because it had been founded by some of the chief executives of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, as some of you might know, is the predecessor of the United Nations, and was set up at the initiative of the American President Wilson in 1919, and set up shop in Geneva. So which brings us back to this dot. And it's this point here, this is Geneva. And Geneva is separate from Vienna, where Mises lived, through a huge chunk of mountains. Essentially, that's what you have. The school was created in 1927. Its mission was to train the staff that this new international organization needed. So they needed staff that were fluent in at least 3 languages and were competent, knew something about economics, history, and politics. So that was the mission of the school, to train such people, which they did. So Mises' contract then was extended on a yearly basis. He eventually stayed 6 years. He probably could have stayed longer. He stayed for 6 years, and during this time, he occasionally went back to Vienna to still work for the chamber as a senior counselor. And especially, and that is most important for the history of Austrian economics and for economics in general, he wrote his most important book, Human Action, or more precisely, the German language predecessor to this book, the title of which is Nationalökonomie, National Economics, or Economics. In 1940, so these were probably the happiest days of his life because he had a very convenient salary and he had a very low teaching load. He had to teach some 2 to 4 hours per week, okay? And so could essentially concentrate on teaching, on his research for his book, which he did. He also got married in those years. He married Gitta Sereni, who was a German actress from Hamburg, who had been living in Austria for many years, and whom he had known for 13 years before getting married to her. So they got married in Geneva in 1938. Then comes World War II, breaks out in 1939. And Mises at first was not very nervous, was unconcerned, because he thought that nothing would really happen, because the French had learned their lesson from World War I, so they would block the German armies somewhere here. The French had created a defense wall, kind of a defense wall that they called the Ligne Maginot. But unfortunately, they created it only here, at the border with Germany. They had neglected to protect also the border with Belgium. The Germans are, of course, smart enough to see this. Well, of course, it's not very high criterion, but still. So they ran over France. And I spare you the details, which are interesting from that point of view, from a military point of view. They ran over France. And so Mises was shocked to see that, well, his retirement plans for Switzerland were in the course of evaporating, right? So the Italians then joined the war as well. When they saw that the French army was destroyed by the German army in the north, they started invading the country from the south. So Switzerland was encircled, and the atmosphere grew somewhat unpleasant for people who were known as the enemies of the Nazi regime, which Mises was. Okay, so he then sought to get out of the country and did so in 1940. Immediately after, so the Germans ran over the French army in May and June 1940. Mises left the country in July 1940, and he arrived in New York City in Manhattan on August 4, 1940. Here he would find then a new country. He became citizen of the United States in 1946 and lived here for the rest of his years, for the rest of his life. It was at first a very difficult start because he had no revenue. He was a relatively old man, 59 years old. Hadn't learned anything that was of practical value. In a seminar in Vienna in the 1920s, they were making jokes. What will we do if one day we will lose our position? And all his pupils agreed that Mises would make a good doorman. But he didn't do that in New York. He survived thanks to a research fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation, and then eventually from an association that is still around, the National Association of Manufacturers. And then after the war, immediately after the war, he really started a new life that was much more to his liking when he was hired by New York University in 1945 as a visiting professor. And there he would then teach 2 classes, one of which was his research seminar, an economic seminar, which would be eventually the training ground for a new generation of Austrian economists. And in fact, the first American generation of Austrian economists, or we might even say the first generation of Misesian economists anytime. One member of this seminar is still among us, is Professor Reiko. So you see that it's the long shadow of Mises, the long shadow of Reiko still on us. So he had a huge impact because he was training Reiko, and there was Hans Sennholz, Murray Rothbard, George Reisman, Israel Kirzner, and many other very important Austrian economists who have kept up the Austrian flag, so to say, after Mises died in the early 1970s. Mises would be visiting with New York University for 24 years. Okay, it's kind of a nice visit. Extended visit. And another important thing also happened when he started cooperating with a new organization called FEE, which you know probably, the Foundation for Economic Education, which was established by Leonard Read in 1946, somewhat north of New York City in Irvington-on-Hudson. And Fee eventually was a big promoter of Austrian economics, especially after Mises had published the English edition of his important book, Human Action, was published in 1949, and had a huge impact on public opinion, especially opinion among intellectuals. So it created some sort of a freedom movement. And Fee then was a very important institution to support this process, organize seminars, print articles and so on, create journals, etc. Human Action also influenced other authors, younger authors, who would here find a basis from which they could start, most notably Murray Rothbard, whom I've already mentioned, and who published his main economics book, Man, Economy and State, in 1962. So these books are very important for Austrians still today because they are systematic treatises of economics. And we have one of the big differences between Austrian economists and other economists who are called mainstream economists, as Austrians are not satisfied to cook up some explanation for a little problem under immediate concern. And Austrians want to know how does this fit in within the overall system of what we already know about the world. And the world is always one, it's unified, there's no contradictions in the world. So if we want to have a coherent account of the real world, we need to also have a coherent theory. It's not contradictory in its different parts. And that's what you do most usefully if you have already a general theoretical framework, which is exactly what Mises and Rothbard have created. Right? So what we'll be doing here during this week is not to Mises and Rothbard, right, or restate this again and again, right? We're not in church. Right? Most of the Austrian faculty, or all of the Austrian faculty, have disagreements with Mises and Rothbard on various points, and we're sometimes also starting in different directions and so on. But we all agree on the fact, well, that we have here a starting point, and that's simply useful and very important, and gives an internal coherence that no other school of economic thought has. And it will remain this way until somebody comes up with an even better book that builds again on this foundation and creates a new starting board for subsequent generations. That's how science works. And of course, so as I said then, so human action had ultimately an impact until the present day, until we have Mises University. Okay, Mises then died in 1973, also in New York City. He was not very active in the last years of his life, which is excusable since he died at the age of 92. We wouldn't expect too much from an octogenarian. And he wrote and published his last book at the age of 81, which is one of his best books, by the way. So it's hope for all of us. Right? If the university throws us out one day, right, we can still write great books. And the title of this book is Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. Wonderful book. And it deals with epistemological problems of economics. And it is, in fact, a systematic critique of the idea that economic research should be done as in the natural sciences, as a scientific program that is called scientism, or sometimes also positivism. Okay, so we have a brief overview of Mises' life, and I will even more briefly now talk about some of the highlights of his work, but I cannot fully do this, and especially what I want to do is to explain to you the significance of his contributions. So I need to first to talk very briefly about, give you some background, talking about the Austrian authors that preceded him, in particular Karl Menger and Böhm-Bawerk. And I cannot talk about them really meaningfully without at least briefly talking about the classical economists and the mercantilists. Okay, so which I will do then. First talk about the classical economists and the mercantilists, then go to the first two generations of Austrian economics, then come to Mises. So classical economics is the school of economic thought that starts with Adam Smith, who publishes in 1776 a book with the title An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And Smith was not very original in what he did, but what he did was to create something that Mises also aspired to do, namely to create a system. Smith summarized and synthesized various strands of arguments that had been developed during the 18th century and were then present at the time of his writing. And he created a system in which he systematically refuted the prevailing economic doctrine and political doctrine of his time, which he called mercantilism. Now, what's the central point of the mercantilist ideas? It's the idea that the wealth of nations essentially depends on the level of aggregate spending. It essentially depends on how much money we spend on consumer goods, and therefore also on producer goods. And since at the time the countries were operating on a metallic standard, so they had gold coins or silver coins, the only way, or one of the most appropriate ways to increase the level of spending is to bring more money into the country, right? And you do this by encouraging exports. If you sell goods abroad, you get money into the country, and by hampering imports, right? So that less money quits the country. So this was the mercantilist program. Benefit exports with subsidies and with monopolies, and hamper imports by tariffs, quotas, and so on. Now, Adam Smith showed that this program is wrong. That is, he didn't deliver a complete demonstration for reasons that I will briefly mention. But in any case, he proposed a completely different perspective on the nature and the causes of the wealth of nations. For Smith, the wealth of nations had nothing to do with the level of spending and had nothing to do with the money supply. Whatever the level of spending, whatever the level of the money supply, the economy could flourish, grow, and operate just fine. The real causes of economic growth, so of higher wealth, were essentially twofold. The first one was the division of labor, and the second one, and even more important, is the accumulation of capital. Because wages and all revenues are ultimately paid out of capital. All investments are paid out of capital. So what you need to do then is to live a frugal life, not spend too much on consumer goods, save a lot, and thereby facilitate further investments in the economy. Adam Smith then crushed the mercantilist political program by stressing 2 points. First of all, if we have a completely free market, what she called a system of natural liberty, then there is a tendency for all capital to be allocated in such a way as it is most productive and most profitable. And each entrepreneur has an incentive to put his capital there where it creates the greatest yield. Now, when the mercantilists come and impose their program, encouraging artificially exports, hampering imports, then this necessarily diverts capital from those employments that would have been most profitable. Okay, so you necessarily impoverish the economy. That's Adam Smith's argument. And it had a great success, not an immediate success, but a great success because the power of his argument began to wear during the next decades, and it came into full dominance around the middle of the 19th century. But still, Smith's analysis had various weaknesses, and ultimately it was overthrown for these weaknesses. And I will mention in particular 3 of them. First of all, Adam Smith did not have any acceptable price theory. He had some attempt of a price theory, but the explanation of prices was not any good. And the significance of this fact is that without a good price theory, you cannot explain human behavior. You cannot explain, in particular, why it is that the price level doesn't matter. How can entrepreneurs adjust, let's say, for example, to a sinking price level? How can they adjust to a sinking level of aggregate expenditure without harming aggregate growth? That's a question that Adam Smith couldn't answer, and he couldn't answer it because he didn't have a price theory. The second weakness in his system was that he didn't take account of the time dimension in the accumulation of capital. And the third major weakness is that he had thrown monetary theory completely overboard. Adam Smith had reacted against the mercantilist program by stressing that the level of monetary spending and hence the money supply is of no concern for growth. Therefore, for him, well, we can forget about money altogether. And as a consequence then, in the 19th century, the way to teach economics was to have two separate courses. In one course, you deal with the real economy, that is non-monetary economy. You just were considering the economy as if it were a big barter organization, so in which apples and oranges were exchanged directly against one another and so forth. And in a separate course, you would deal with money and banking. The separate course, the monetary course, would just deal with the price level and with the organization of the banking system and sometimes also with business cycles. But the main course was the course of the real economy, which dealt with wealth, the causes of wealth, distribution, how wealth is distributed and consumed. Now, of course, it was easy to attack Adam Smith on all these three accounts, and he was being attacked and on other accounts as well. Now, the significance of Austrian economics is that it arises as a school of thought that repairs these deficiencies in classical economics. What the Austrians did not do was to contest Smith's central thesis. And the central thesis concerned the origin of growth, the causes of growth, and his critique of the mercantilist program. The Austrians accepted this, but they further refined it. What they did was to add other elements to improve Smith there where he was bad, weak in any rate. So the first element was added by Karl Menger, who in 1871 publishes his Principles of Economics. And what Menger does was to provide a coherent and realistic theory of value and prices. So tomorrow morning, Professor Herbener will explain this to you in more detail, but I will just emphasize the central point, because again, it will be good that he just says the same thing with different words. Always good to repeat at the important points. Right? The central weakness in Smith's theory was that he could not connect utility with prices, subjective value with prices. For Smith, such an explanation would always run into contradictions, into paradoxes. The argument, the example he gave was one of two goods, diamonds and water. Water, he says, has a very high subjective utility, subjective value, because without water we couldn't survive. Diamonds, you can very well live without diamonds. Okay, I see now certain faces. Yes, certain women, of course, think they could not live with diamonds. There's a different concern. Okay. On the other hand, but if it was so that utility then determines price, water should have a very high price and diamonds should have a lower price. But that's not the case. Diamonds have a very high price and water is often comes for free. So what's the error in Smith's argument? His error is that he has reasoned in terms of classes of goods, total quantities, rather than the partial quantities that are always exchanged on the market. Smith's argument would be correct if one had to choose between all water in the world and all diamonds in the world. But then, of course, water would get a higher price than all the diamonds, precisely because it's more valuable. But that's not the choice that we confront in the market economy. We never have to choose between all the water in the world and all the diamonds, but just between an additional gallon of water and an additional carat or half carat or 3 carats, depending on your wallet, that you buy, given the existing supply of water and of diamonds. And given the enormous existing supply of water in Western Europe and on the North American continent, any additional gallon has a very low value, so it comes also then as at a low price. And any additional diamond, because the available supply is relatively small, comes at a high price. So we can reconcile value with price. The paradox of value that Smith had in mind is resolved. The next step then came from the hands of Böhm-Bawerk, who brought the time element into, stressed the time element in the accumulation of capital and in particular in the pricing of capital goods. So what Böhm-Bawerk stressed was that as a consequence of the passage of time, future goods tend to have a lower value than present goods of the same sort. This is called time preference. And time preference, according to Böhm-Bawerk, is the cause of interest rates being paid on the market, and is therefore also the cause of the different evaluation of producers' goods as compared to consumer goods, and so on. The third element that also comes from Böhm-Bawerk is to create an Austrian analysis of the economy as a whole. So with these two new elements, the theory of marginal value developed by Menger, and his own approach stressing the time element, the passage of time in human action, Böhm-Bawerk created now an analysis, like Smith, of the economy as a whole. And what he showed was, in this economy as a whole, all entrepreneurs, all investors are ultimately competing for the same type of good, which he called present goods. Okay, you need present goods, that is in particular consumer goods, to get any production process going, because you need to feed the people that are involved in creating the product. And since, therefore, all investment projects, whatever their sector, tomato growers, car producers, projector producers, and so on, they all need to employ people. Therefore, they all need to have access to present goods. They are all competing for present goods. The economy the market is a huge process that integrates all different producers into one common, coherent whole that is geared toward the satisfaction of consumer demand. And only the most important investment projects at any point of time get realized. And others are relegated to later moments of time. So, this was the situation. These are the three elements that I should like to stress. There were others as well. So when Mises started working, this was the situation. So there was one element that was still lacking. One problem had not yet been addressed in among the Smithian weaknesses, and this was the absence of money. So even Böhm-Bawerk, who had created an analysis of the market process as a whole, had reasoned as if the economy was by and large a huge barter economy. Consumer goods were being exchanged directly against one another and against producer goods, but there was no intermediation through money. And one of the reasons why this was so, why nobody had done it, was because many people thought this would be impossible in the case of money. There would be a vicious circle of explanation. Why is this so? Well, in the case of a consumer good, we explain its price in terms of subjective value. In the case of money, the subjective value depends on the purchasing power of the object, right? I mean, the subjective value that a dollar bill has for you will depend on how much things you can buy for it. But so then we're in a circle. We want to explain the price with the help of the subjective value of money, but the subjective value in its turn depends on price. So we are explaining the egg with the hen and the hen with the egg. We are running in a circle. Mises says not so. We can get out of the circle if we consider that, as precisely in the case of the egg and the hen, it's a diachronic process. Okay. So it's not that the price at this point of time, price is being paid, monetary price is being paid, determine the value of money at this point of time, and this value of money at this point of time determines the prices. Rather, this value of money right now determines present prices, but the value itself is determined by the prices that have existed in the past. Okay? So these prices that have existed in the past are in their turn determined by the previous subjective value of money as it existed, which was in turn determined by previous prices of money prices and so on. So we get out of the circle, we have a causal explanation that is stretched out in time. And the only difficulty that remains then is to get a starting point. Does this run back indefinitely? So do we have an egg and a hen problem? And Mises says, no, we do not, because there was a point of time in the past when there has not yet been used any money. When those goods that we use now as money, namely, for example, silver coins or gold coins, had been used only for industrial purposes or for not for monetary, for an exchange service. So at this point of time, they were evaluated only in the light of these non-monetary services and not by any previous prices that existed for them. So we have a coherent explanation of the value of money, a new theory of the value of money and of money prices that fits into this new theory established by Karl Menger. So we have here an example of this concern that I mentioned before. You do not just set out for an ad hoc explanation of any phenomenon, of any problem that you have, but you want to have a coherent explanation that fits into what you already know about the economy. That's what Mises did. And then he did something else, well, I will just mention because I'm running out of time. He, in particular, made three very important contributions to economics about, again, we will talk, which we will talk during the week. The first one is that he created a new business cycle theory. And this he did in his first book, The Theory of Money and Credit, first published in 1912, the same book in which he developed his integration of value theory and monetary theory. It's the same book. The first two parts deal with the value problem, and then in the third part, he sets out to propose this new business cycle theory. What he does here is to explain the following. He says, if we have an artificial creation of the money supply, in particular through fractional reserve banks, then entrepreneurs can be deluded about the amount of savings that are available in the economy, and the interest rate therefore can fall. If the interest rate falls, is therefore falling artificially, this sounds like a good thing because we can now, finance investment projects that would otherwise not have been worth a while, or would have been too expensive. So it sounds like a good thing, but it's actually a bad thing. That's what Mises explains. So Mises ultimately tells us we have to strictly distinguish between the amount of investment projects that we start and the amount of investment projects that we finish. Okay, that's what I hope your mother has told you very often. Focus on those things that you can do, get them done, and don't distract yourself. Don't do too many things because you will ultimately do nothing well. Okay, and it's a little bit the same thing with the economy. If too many investment projects are begun, we cannot complete them all. Because the number of projects that we can complete always depends on the real resources available in the economy. So the amount of workers and their knowledge, the streets that we have, the buildings that we have, the machinery, and so on, real stuff. And this real stuff does not increase, does not become available in greater quantities, just we increase the money supply, because we increase the money supply. Right? So if we now, because thanks to the increased money supply, the interest rate falls, if we now start more investment projects, then ultimately we start too many things, way more things than we can finish. And this we will learn at some point after this fateful decision, namely when we are running out of the real stuff that is necessary to finance, to keep going with our investment projects. That's when the crisis sets in. So that is Mises' business cycle theory, and you will learn more about this tomorrow and the day after. The two other important contributions are his theory of socialism, his critique of socialism, which is an outgrowth of his value theory, the value theory that he started in this first book, The Theory of Money and Credit. So in 1920, he published this an important article, and followed by an important book, 1922, Socialism, in which he explains that socialism cannot work because it cannot rely on economic calculation as a criterion to decide which investment projects should be realized and which not. In a market economy, the criterion to decide which projects should be realized is profitability. If one project A that yields you 13% of profitability, another project B is 5% of profitability, you have a criterion in terms of which both projects are comparable. Okay, and you can decide yourself for the 13% project and having a good conscience because you are serving consumers more than with a 5% project. Now, this of course presupposes that there be market prices both for your product and for the factors of production. Otherwise, you cannot calculate a profitability. Right? Profitability is revenue minus cost divided by cost, very roughly. If you don't have prices, then of course you cannot calculate, you cannot perform this. You have only real goods that are being produced, and they are therefore heteronomous. And you're producing milk on the one investment project, and you're producing cars in the other. How do you want to compare this? You cannot. And we have a problem of this sort exactly in socialist economies. Socialism is defined by the following criterion, that we have common ownership of all means of production. Now, if there's common ownership, then you cannot have prices for factors of production. Right? You cannot exchange with yourself. You cannot take out a dollar bill out of the right pocket and push it into the left pocket. That's not exchange. Okay? Exchange presupposes the presence of several owners, distinct owners. Otherwise, there can be no exchange. So in socialism, by definition, there are no prices for factors of production. Therefore, you cannot calculate profit rates for different investment projects. Therefore, you're at a loss at distinguishing which projects are more important than others, especially if the economy grows big and complex. The last important contribution that Mises made was to develop a new epistemology of the social sciences and of economics in particular. Economics had come under attack by the middle of the 1920s from socialists who claimed that the arguments of the economists were based on no science at all, it was just ideology. So a true science would have to look differently, would have to proceed as in the natural sciences, or would have to study history and so on. And the challenge here was then to clarify the nature of economic science. How does it relate to the facts? Which kind of facts does it ultimately describe? And Mises here held famously that economics is a science a priori. It's an a prioristic discipline. That is, it relates to a level of reality that is not accessible to the senses. We cannot see it, we cannot hear it. I'll give you just one example, choice. We cannot observe choice, and still it's fundamental for economics. If choice doesn't exist, then there's no value, there are no prices, and so on. It's just behavior through time. How do you know that I make choices? I do make choices. I assure you I could stop talking now, right? And so on. So I can make choices. But of course, not because I behave in a certain way that you can observe my choice. And you cannot observe the choice. You do not see, for example, the alternatives that I could also pick. So we know about choice. It's empirical knowledge that we have because we can reflect on our own action, but it's not something that we know through our senses. We cannot hear it, we cannot see it, smell it, etc. Same thing for scarcity. You cannot observe scarcity, and still it's fundamental for economics. So what Mises says is, so economics is a science that relates to this layer of reality, which is not accessible to the senses, and is, in effect, fundamental for that which we can see, because this level of reality comes before what we actually see. Right? My choice comes before what I do in actual practice. Right? So it's a priori to what is accessible to our sense apparatus. Mises develops these thoughts as from 1929. Then first in a book in 1933, Epistemological Problems of Economics, and later on two other books that are important, Theory and History, 1957, and the book that I already mentioned, Ultimate Foundations of Economic Science, 1962. This was all for the moment. There's a lot of stuff. I don't expect that you understand everything that I said, which reminds me always of the wise words of my physics professor at the university, who said, well, a lecture in which you understand more than 80% is not worth a while. So in this sense, I hope that my lecture has been worthwhile for some of you, and wish you a good evening.